So, equality is a part of the American ideal. We don't have it as part of the motto of our country like France does and Haiti does, but we have never had any sort of legally established aristocracy in this country, and we at least give lip service to legal equality in the country as well. And in the Constitution, of course, the 14th Amendment. So the first section of the 14th Amendment says this. This is actually the only mention of equality in the Constitution, but it requires equal protection of the laws. So that's part of our American ideal, I think. And what we want to do is to explore what this ideal is and whether it ought to be an ideal, and what domains do we care about equality and so forth. So let me start by asking our panelists this. I think oftentimes when people think about issues of inequality, they focus on economic inequality, on inequality in wealth and income. Although, of course, I mentioned some other examples of inequality that might have drawn your attention to those as well, but frequently people think about inequality in wealth and income. And of course, that's only one of the domains in which inequality raises moral concerns. And so I want to ask our panelists what other areas of human activity raise concerns about, and raise moral concerns about equality.
Okay, so well, first I want to say thank you for the invitation to be here. Really happy to be here in such a wonderful company. Looking forward to the two-day event. And it certainly wasn't my doing to have the universities listed in the order that they were. And I'm sure some folks are hoping that's not going to be the final rankings for the football. But anyway, we'll see what happens. I think probably a good thing to start with respect to this question is Martin Luther King once, this is a paraphrase, said, of all the good things in life, whites have twice as much as blacks. And of all the bad things in life, blacks have half what whites have. And, you know, maybe the numbers are a bit different than they were when he said this in the mid-60s or so. But what he was calling attention to is the various gaps between blacks and whites along different measures of well-being. So we distinguish roughly between the haves and the have-nots, and then those that fall in between. And we do this in many domains, income and wealth certainly, but we also see these gaps in domains of education, for example, thinking about the racial achievement and attainment gap. There's also an ethnic achievement and attainment gap. We see this, of course, in the domain of health, when we're looking at health disparities and health outcomes, access to care, who's getting prescribed pain medicine and who's not. We certainly see it in the domain of crime and punishment, not just in terms of the obvious, who's getting stopped by the police and frisked, but we see it in sentencing practices. We see it in, who gets parole, who doesn't. And there are other areas as well in the domain of politics, for example. But what we're dealing with is the fact that as a society, we divvy up various benefits and burdens of our social cooperation. And then we, largely thanks to the work of social scientists in the room, we take measures based on identifying groups of individuals that fit certain characteristics. And then we look at these disparities, taking those various ways of carving ourselves up into account. And what we find across many of these domains is that there are these gaps, and there are, for sure, racially significant differences when we look in these domains. There are differences having to do with gender, there are differences having to do with ethnicity. We're thinking about Canada, we've got differences having to do with language use and so forth. And so I think that all the areas where we've got goodies to give out and we've got burdens to levy are areas we're going to find these gaps, essentially.
Rekha, and I should mention Rekha is showing great courage through pain and being here. She dislocated her shoulder last night. And so she had a kind of unpleasant introduction to Columbus, but I'm glad to have you here with us.
Thanks. I'm sorry, I'm a little hazy with the pain meds I'm on. So that's my excuse. Anyway.
Are you feeling good?
Not exactly. It's like I was trying to strike the right balance between not being in too much pain and not being too drowsy from them. And we'll see as things go if that works out. So one of the things, let's see. Sure. So one of the things we might think about when we're looking at all of the different sorts of inequalities we have in our society, economic ones, so great gaps between the working class and the wealthy in our society in income and wealth, as well as differences in legal and political rights, in health outcomes, in social attainment of education. One of the things we notice is that there are lots of different things we might be talking about when we talk about inequality. So some of those inequalities concern differences in what people have or in how they fare. Others of them concern differences in the rights that people are granted by our society. And still other inequalities we might talk about concern differences in people's social standing. So what I mean by social standing is if we take cases where different individuals are able to do the same thing. So when same-sex couples are granted the right to say civil partnership and are given the same benefits as heterosexual couples, but what they are given has a different label, we might say that there is an unequal standing, or that's symbolic based on the different terminology we use for those different categories. So inequalities kind of fit into these different categories, I think.
So these are rather diverse domains. Should we think of inequality as a single phenomenon that manifests across different domains, or should we think of inequality as really quite different in these different domains?
Well, I mean, some of the more practically oriented people in the room might have a question on their mind. Well, does this really matter? For sure, but I think we certainly can say, just at a very general level, in each domain, we're just talking about these gaps, right, between the haves and the have-nots, however we're going to characterize them. And so to the extent that if we're talking about some kind of disparity in police stops versus some disparity in test scores versus some disparity in health outcomes, we're talking about, essentially, it seems to me, the same thing. But, of course, we're in the health field, we're in the crime and punishment field, or we're in the educational field. So we've got different sets of concerns, we've got different kinds of policy ramifications, we've got different kinds of data sets that we're paying attention to, and of course, I know we'll touch on this later, there's no reason to think that these domains are completely unrelated. We know that too, it's very complex. But I, for one, see no problem with saying, look, we're essentially dealing with the same thing. We've got different domains, and each domain brings with it its own questions, not necessarily unrelated, the kind of data that's at issue. But we've got to bring our methods to bear to unpack that, but we're still dealing with the essential problem. There seems to be a gap of some kind, and certainly some people think that there's a problem in some cases. And that's another thing that we have to deal with for this conference, right? The title is, when and why do these gaps matter. And so one way to sort of think about that question is as an ethical one in some sense. Should we care? What should we do about it? And who's on the hook for doing something about it? Is it us? Is it the government? Is it the taxpayer? You know, so forth and so on. So I would say we're dealing with the same issue, different domains, different questions, but there's this difference between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah. And the question of whether it is to be thought of as one phenomenon that manifests into or different phenomena is a very abstract question, as you noted initially. But the question of whether our moral concern is the same in these different domains is a more substantive moral question. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about the different bases for being concerned about inequality. I mean, sometimes concerns with inequality get represented as kind of a formal concern with just the pattern of distribution, and it sort of removes it from real human interest. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about why should we care about inequality, and does it vary from one domain to another?
Okay, so good. I mean, so here's an image, right? I mean, I don't have my whiteboard, or else I'd try to do it, but you know, so here's an image, you know, and take this line, and you know, let's make 3 of them, and we've got these gaps. We've got these gaps between the haves and the have-nots, right? And I don't care if you're talking about money, police stops, test scores, health outcomes, whatever you want to talk, whatever your thing is. But we've got these lines. Now, it seems like we've got a couple of ways to go with this. We can hold the position of the haves fixed or constant to the extent that we can and improve the position of the worse off. That would be one way to close these gaps, mitigate these disparities. We could focus our efforts on the haves. This is tricky. I know we're in an election year. I mean, I don't want to say exactly what that might mean, but I don't want to say make their position worse, but something like that, right? Make them, you know, I don't know. We want to make them, you know, less healthy. We want to have the police stop them more, right? You know, I don't know. I'll let you sort of have at that. But we could make them a bit, you know, pull them down a bit, and you know, keep the position of the worse off, make sure they don't get any worse. Or we can maybe go at it in both ways. We can. You know, we can take a little from the top, give a little to the bottom, and we can mitigate. We can get these test scores to not look differences that look so dramatic. We can get these health outcomes to not look so dramatic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what the philosopher might bring to the conversation are some considerations about why we should pursue, you know, any one of those strategies, right? Now, one thing that some people do to start the conversation is they focus on the position of the worse off. And they talk about the suffering of the worse off. Some people are destitute. And for essentially humanitarian reasons, we shouldn't live with this as a society. Right? We shouldn't live with the worse off being the way they are. And then we should enact some kinds of policies to deal with this, make better outcomes, get the test scores up for these people, and so forth and so on. Now, the obvious thing we're going to say about this is, well, maybe we might do all of that, but that's perfectly compatible with there still being a big difference between their position and the position of everybody that's better off. So this humanitarian reason we might have for focusing on human suffering or destitution is not one that necessarily seems to get us at the relative differences between folks. And so we've yet to sort of have maybe a reason in that sense to close the gaps, right? I mean, so then you might say, well, and Rekha makes this point about not just disparities in stuff, but disparities in status. And that's an important idea, I think, because if we say that it's important that we treat one another as having equal worth, equal status, and we think that disparities along these different dimensions somehow undermine treating one another as having equal worth and equal status. If these kids are getting all the good scores, these kids are getting the best jobs, these folks are getting stopped more by the police, these folks are getting more pain meds than these people. These people have more Whole Foods in their neighborhood than these people. Then, if our status as equal beings is implicated, that gives us a reason now, an ethical reason, to go after these gaps in a serious way, trying to close them, right? So that's one kind of reason, concerns about equal status, equal worth, that we may draw on when we've got our ethical hats on, to say, here's why our law and policy makers should do something about these disparities. Because if you continue to pull over these young African American males, that's sending the message that their status is not the same as all the other white kids that go around and don't have to worry about these kinds of things. And that's not something we want to commit ourselves to as a society when we claim that equality is a value that we hold dear.
So let me, Derrick, you touched on something I wanted to ask both of you about. And that's, some of you will be familiar with John Rawls, one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century, and his theory of justice, which separates out different goods that human beings can experience that are under the relatively direct control of social arrangements. And Rawls insists that there be equality with respect to rights and liberties. That's a straightforward egalitarian demand, he thinks his theory entails. But with respect to the other social goods, which here are described as the social and economic inequalities, Rawls doesn't demand equality, doesn't think justice requires that. What justice requires is that social arrangements be made in a way that ensure that the worst off are as well off as possible. And he thinks that theory is as egalitarian as it's reasonable to be, because if we demand any more equality, we're actually making the poor less well off in order to get greater levels of equality. Now, he does require, and this, so you've already touched on a reason for thinking that that's not adequate because of the way in which these social and economic inequalities may affect such things as social status and seeing one another as being equals. But so let me not press that, but go on to the third point. The Rawls requires not equality in the distribution of the other social goods, but that you maximize the level of well-being of the worst off. But it has to be done under conditions of fair opportunity. You have to have a fair equality of opportunity. And we hear this oftentimes when people raise egalitarian concerns. We hear people say, look, I think that I don't care about equality of outcome. I care about equality of opportunity, and then let the outcomes be what they may. So is equality of opportunity sufficient then?
Okay, okay, so this is whenever you put Rawls on the table. It's very complicated. So we can, but we've done it. So here we are. Here we are.
I did.
Here Don did it in particular. So let's see what we can do. Let's see what we can do with this. Okay, so I guess going back to a part of the first question, right? And I'd be curious to know what some of my social scientist colleagues think about this, but there are probably not like a ton of people that are just so infatuated with like patterns that look like more equal that they think that we should simply instantiate those wherever we can, right? Like there's just something about equality that looks good. It fits our eye. I mean, we just want it wherever we can get it. I suspect that there are not a lot of people like that out there. We should all have the same amount of money in our bank account. We should all have the same size house. We should all have the same number of degrees. Maybe we should all have the same kind of health outcomes. I mean, there are probably not a lot of people out there like that. And there's certainly not a lot of people out there that don't think we should all have the same income and wealth. So I would say that most kind of, I don't want to say sensible, but, realistic egalitarians are not saying that we should go through society making everybody substantively equal, so to speak, okay? Now, of course we can say, well, what benefits might come from some people being able to have more money, more wealth? And one thing you might say is that, well, you might think that it's good that we've got some people out there that can donate the money to help build this wonderful space. Because otherwise we'd be sitting outside today maybe. It's a little warm for that, right? But for that to happen, maybe they've got to have some incentives to go out and make that kind of money, right? And they can choose to do that. Some of us might not choose to do that because, I certainly wouldn't choose to do that because I like sitting in this nice space that they helped build, talking to you guys and reading my books and stuff. That's, I like reading books and I like writing and talking to people and teaching students. So I'm not going to go get whatever it takes to make this building. But it's good that some people are doing it, obviously. So one thing you might say for why we should be okay with social and economic, let's say just economic inequalities, is because you might try to argue that gives some people incentive to go after the money, and their going after the money can benefit us as a society in all kinds of ways. We've got industry, and so forth and so on, right? You know how that would go. Now, this speaks directly, of course, this is one way to speak to this question of outcome versus opportunity. Another thing we might say about why gaps can be a problem is if the gap means that people on the short end of it, and my social scientist guys, forgive me for using this kind of language, I know you don't use it, but anyway, I'm using it right now. This kind of gap is if those on the short tail of the disparity are somehow behind the 8 ball when it comes to being able to compete for any of society's goods or resources. So you might think, for example, people that come from certain parts of town or have certain kind of educational backgrounds are going to be in sort of a unfair position in the race. And some people like this analogy of a race for resources or for things that society has to offer. And that's not fair, right? And so this language of opportunity, however, says, look, we better make sure that everybody's got the same chance to compete for the goodies, right? And in this country, one of the things that has been the great equalizer, as we all know, sitting in this classroom, is people have said education. You got to give people education so that they can compete for the goodies that society has to offer. But of course, they didn't anticipate charter schools. They didn't anticipate the ways in which people that are well-to-do can buy up opportunities for their kids over the summer and during the school year so that they can better compete for the better schools, which sends them on the better path, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But some people can say, well, look, so long as folks have the opportunity for schooling, then society is doing what it can to see to it that the playing field is fair. So it's tricky, though, because when you look at the outcome disparities, it's not unreasonable to think that something, if the outcome disparities are really significant, you might think there's something amiss here. How do you explain these patterns unless you just assume that these folks are just so inferior, right, that they can't cut it? Well, something must be amiss in the opportunity structure. Or maybe there's something kind of targeting these people that are holding them back. So I think that we gotta pay attention to disparities, to the outcomes. And if we're being critical, we have to think that if they're gross, something must be amiss, unless you're prepared to hold really serious assumptions about people who are not looking better in these outcomes, if you see what I mean. So I, for one, wouldn't want to say we should ignore the outcomes, even in a society that has all kinds of ways of celebrating its commitment to opportunity. But I do think that if we can really provide for equality of opportunity, then these outcomes shouldn't really look the way they do. They should be more random, if you see what I mean.
So, to his credit, Rawls worries a lot about what fair equality of opportunity means. And it most distinctly doesn't mean what he calls careers open to talent. It's just sort of make sure there's no discrimination at the point of hiring. Just to support one of the points you made here, I saw a statistic recently which was pretty shocking. It said that children raised in middle-class households have, on average, 35 children's books per child. And children raised in lower income, impoverished neighborhood, the ratio is 35 children to one book in the household. So if children are going, if they're starting school not having had any children's books in the household, not having been read to, and so forth, we're starting off with not fair opportunity right from the beginning, it seems to me. Okay, I want to point out that Rekha's feeling a little uncertain of herself with the pain meds, and so we're being kind to her, and she will jump in when she wants to. So we've mentioned a couple times, but not really said much about the ways in which inequalities in these different domains interact with one another. Yeah. And I'd like to ask for more discussion of that. It seems to me that there are pretty clear causal interactions. I mean, educational inequality affects income and wealth inequality. There are also symbolic connections between these, and I think one of Rekha's points really touches on that as well. But you know, if you could say more about these interactions, because putting up this list of different domains makes it sound like we can separate these.
Good.
But of course, they're not separated in the real world. They interact in a significant way, and I think that's actually an important thing to say in response to Rawls here, that when you have, there's a serious concern that when you have severe disparities in income and wealth, that affects rights and liberties. At least it affects them if you're looking at rights and liberties not merely as kind of formal rights and liberties, but the real ability to exercise a right or a liberty. Yeah. So I'd like you to talk more about the interactions between the different domains that we've laid out.
Yeah. So this is a tough one, and one that I think all of us in the room can say a lot about. The two kinds of cases that come to mind to me immediately are the interactions between money and political power and influence, and money and class standing, maybe, and navigating the K through 12 educational system. So maybe I'll just start with those, and maybe we could have leave some time for some back and forth with the audience. People can say different things. So another thing you might say about this gap between the haves and the have-nots that would make you worry about it from the ethical point of view is you may get worried if you think that certain gaps between us, like income, wealth gaps, lead some people to have greater control and influence in pushing agendas that serve their interests. And certainly, being in this election season, and all of us have been going through the paper and so forth, one big concern has been, do people with greater wealth ultimately have greater influence in helping to set public policy because of the kinds of access that they get to politicians? So just, I think yesterday, there was a headline about Hillary Clinton, and in the Times, and basically the report was that she hasn't been able to replicate Obama's success with the small dollar donors. And so presumably this is why she's spending so much time with the big money donors, right? Because if I can't get $1 from like 1 million people, maybe I can get $10 million from 10 of them, you know, and then, you know, I got to go to these fundraisers, right? Now, I mean, what are these big donors going to get in return, right, in the way of influence and so forth? So, I mean, that's the kind of thing we worry about when we think about disparities in political influence and disparities in wealth and how they may be interacting in ways that give some folks more control and influence over others. Now, it might be that the control and influence is harmless. So maybe the big money donors are going to just enact the same kind of policies we would, you know? Maybe not, right? But if it could be very pernicious, of course, because it could just lead to policies that, you know, benefit them in ways that might be at the expense of the rest of us. And if so, we say this is ethically objectionable because here's a common good that we have, the political process, the institutions that we've all bound ourselves by, and we have a common hand in shaping. But it's being leveraged by people who have differences in wealth that seem to be arbitrary, at least from our point of view, to whether one should have a greater influence in the political process. I mean, we're scholars in here. Somebody said, well, look, maybe you should just know some stuff to have greater, if we're going to have greater influence, let it be on the basis of what you know, not on how much money you have, right? That's where we should, you know, benefit those who actually know some stuff, right? We might say. So that's one domain where they clearly interact, and it opens up space for another kind of considerations about domination or the potential of domination when there's too much control and influence. Here's a case that some of you are familiar with because there's some parents in the room, and we got to just make a confession. So you know when you had your kids in primary and secondary school, you know, if something went down in school that you weren't happy with, you were in there. And you kind of knew how to navigate the setup. I mean, you were going to get a hearing with the teacher. If the teacher wasn't responsive, you go to the principal. And you know what happens if the principal wasn't responsible? You go to the superintendent. But you were going to navigate the space to make sure your kid was going to get a fair shot, or whatever it was. But what about people that can't really navigate that space? They don't have like the social capital, maybe not the literacy, maybe not the time, because they got like 3 or 4 jobs. They can't even go to the parent-teacher conference. So you got some new resource coming into the school, some new opportunity, and you better believe that we're going to be on it, right? Because we can navigate the space. Even if it's an opportunity that's meant to help the people that are worse off, those of us who will navigate the space. And this is a challenge I'm actually facing now in some of my own scholarship. I just finished a book on the achievement gap, the origins of the achievement gap in education I wrote with a historian of ed. And, you know, in the book we go into how we need to think about empowering school leaders to do things to change these sorting practices in school, like sorting practices that we see and who gets disciplined, who doesn't, who gets put in special ed for being a bad kid, who gets put in special ed for needing a little extra help. Tracking, who gets in the advanced classes, who doesn't. All of which enforce this idea of unequal standing. But this has a very long history in America. And so we tell the story of this history and show how it's connected to these contemporary sorting practices. Now, one of the things we want to say is that maybe you can just come in, bring certain kind of programs into the school, and that's going to somehow benefit those who need the help. But as I'm telling you now, that's not so obvious. If we also have parents in the building that can negotiate the space better to take advantage of the opportunity, what do we do about that? So this is where I said this thing gets tricky. Do we somehow tie their hands so that these parents who are capable of navigating the space can't really operate? But then what are they going to do? They're going to leave the public school. They're going to go to the charter school. It's complicated. But anyway, I don't want to go there because they're going to be here all day helping me work out my problem. That's my problem. That's not your problem. Sorry about that. Don, is that a little bit at least on the interaction stuff?
Sure. There is a lot more to say, obviously.
There's a lot more to say about
that's
that?
a great example, yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. We started by saying that equality is a part of the American ideal. At
Yeah.
least we give lip service
Yes.
to certain forms of equality. But
Yeah.
if that's true, it's even more clearly true that liberty or freedom is a part of the American ideal. And there are worries about the compatibility of liberty with equality. Some people think that inequality, perhaps even very gross inequality, is going to be the practically inevitable outcome if you allow people liberty, or as Robert Nozick said, sort of memorably, if you want to maintain a particular pattern of distribution of wealth and income, to take that example, you have to constantly interfere with capitalist acts between consenting adults. So the only way to realize the ideal that some people have of equality really is to give up on a great deal of what we care about for freedom. So do you think this tension between freedom and equality is real? If it is, how is it to be navigated? How are we to strike a balance? How should we be thinking about this?
See, this is the thing about philosophers, right? Just take this is early morning, we're just trying to get into the conference, and then you get these really hard questions, you know? You would like to let's get a time and get us warmed up, you know?
Hey, you're a philosopher, Derrick.
Yeah, but I can't, he don't feel bad for me. He don't want to hear the violin. He said, Derrick, answer the question. So, he don't want to, we don't do violins in philosophy or economics, you know? I'm not to say, but anyway, we got a reputation. Okay, so no violin. This is hard. This is tough. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave for sure, right? You know, we got the Constitution, we got the Equal Protection Clause, but we got liberty. And, you know, for many people, I've had the good fortune to live in deep, deep blue states and deep, deep red states. And I tell you, I've learned so much over the years. And I mean deep red. I was in College Station, Texas. I was an Aggie for a little while. I was out near Gigaman. Right? I was down in Aggieland, and that's when they was playing some serious football too, before they went to the SEC. And then I was a Jayhawk. And I got to spend some time with Sam Brownback of all people, believe it or not. But that's over coffee, we can tell you about that. But the folks in Texas, the folks in Kansas, for sure, put a lot of weight on liberty. Now, philosophers have dealt with this. I would say one of the biggest philosophical developments after Rawls, in fact, was an effort by some giants of our discipline to deal with this tension between liberty and equality within an egalitarian framework. And these names probably won't mean anything to most of you, but the names associated with this effort are Ronald Dworkin and G.A. Cohen, most significantly. And Cohen in particular, basically, you know, just here was the thought. The libertarian crowd, or the red state crowd, says, you egalitarians, you're all about equality, you're about resource distribution, blah, 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 blah. But this is also the land of liberty. And we take that just as seriously. So you guys seem to not take it very seriously. And so what these egalitarians did was they said, well, look, we can certainly take liberty seriously. And here's how we can do that. When we start thinking about disparities or inequalities, the way to take liberty more seriously is to ask ourselves whether these disparities have something to do with people's choices, people's exercise of their freedom, or just like dumb luck of being born to the wrong parents in the wrong neighborhood with the wrong genes, for example. Now that's very different from just saying, you know, I'll have that supersized fries and shake, right? Hey, that's a choice. Or you know what, I don't really feel like studying today. I want to play ball or hockey in something, if you're from Canada. You want to play hockey up there, you know, right? Or, right, you know, I can make some extra money, but I'd just rather chill, right? I take a job, but I don't really like that job. So here's where we start investigating what contribution the person's choice or effort or lack of effort makes to where they stand. Now, of course, this gets really tricky when we start generalizing over groups. Some of us have tiger moms in the house. Some of us don't. Some races have tiger moms in the house. Some races don't. Then it gets like really tricky, but that happens, right? So the egalitarian said, look, our position is going to be that we have obligations of justice to do something about these gaps where they are largely the result of circumstances beyond people's control. Now, that's got to get unpacked in all kinds of ways, but that's a first approximation of a place to start. So, for example, if it's discrimination, if it's that we don't have whole foods, organic foods in certain neighborhoods, or people got to go through great distances to get them, and that's a structural thing. If all the jobs are in the suburbs and there's no transportation to get people to the jobs, William Julius Wilson's work, right? That's structural. That's not about them, it's about us. Then justice demands that we address it. But if people are not putting in the effort, then no. We got to come up with other kinds of reasons to help them, but they won't be egalitarian ones. So this is how egalitarianism developed to try to answer the libertarians and the red state folks who said you guys are not serious about freedom. Now, it won't be surprising that there were egalitarians who weren't happy with this accommodation. One of them happens to be a colleague of mine at Michigan, Elizabeth Anderson. But, you know, that's a little bit down the road. So I think this is a real challenge. And here's also where I think that philosophers could use put more careful attention into what some of our social science colleagues are doing and telling us about some of the causal mechanisms involved in these different domains. You got to be very careful when you start making very strong claims about what causes what, because it's just very complicated. And if you get pressed, you know, you're going to have to come up with some data at some point or know somebody who came up with it. But there's a lot of disagreement in the social sciences, too, about these issues. But in any event, here's where the causes come in, I think. We get people more on the hook for where they end up if we think that where they end up is somehow attributable to their action or inaction. We're more on the hook, collectively, if it's due to they were born that way, or we've set up traffic so that things go here and not there. Then we're on the hook, right? So I think that is a very rough way to at least point to how philosophers have dealt with this very, I think, serious challenge. And also lets us see really what I think, if you go talk to your students, I do this all the time. I say to my students, I say, I give them a case, and I say, hey, this guy, he's an extreme sports guy. And, he just wants to climb a mountain, jump off a bridge, and he just keeps getting hurt. And of course, he comes into the hospital, he doesn't have health care because he's spending all his time, jumping off of bridges and climbing mountains, and he's got to get treated. Like, how many times we got to treat this guy and pay for it, right? And so some students say, well, look, probably not many more. So some of them say not at all. Because why? Because look, the guy is jumping off of bridges and scaling mountains. That's on him.
So this actually connects with, and you touched on your answer with another question I wanted to ask. Even if we're fairly content with there being disparities in certain domains, either because they work to the advantage of the worst off or they are somehow the responsibility of the individual, we might be much less sanguine about that if those disparities run along certain lines like race or gender or ethnicity or something like that. So I guess that makes me think it's not just what disparities there are, but sort of what they're determined based on. And what do you think about that? Is that a special reason for concern?
I would say no. But let me tell you why I say that. Oh man, that's a hard question, man. Can you give me like an off-speed pitch or something? And just something. Let me hit something, right? You throwing all these fastballs. Darn. Okay, no, really. I mean, first of all, the question I think is not as well formulated as I like it to be, but I think I got the gist of it. Look. You know, some people get into this thing, right? Particularly right today in the university, right? When we've got multiculturalism, we got diversity. It's like we got like differences. We're different in all kinds of ways. And one of the things that can happen once you bring differences in the room is like, you don't want to get into like a match, like, whose difference is like the most different, right? Or whose difference is the most urgent, right? Or who got screwed the most, right? You just don't want to go there. I don't. I just don't find that very productive. So that's part of where my saying no like comes from initially. I don't really have a horse in that, whose difference is the worst difference race. I know in my own work, I've been concerned about the legacy of black chattel slavery in the United States of America, where people were brought over from Africa in bondage, and they were made to serve, and they were treated as if they were nothing but property. Now, I know that the indigenous people who were here before Columbus got a bad rap, women have gotten a bad rap, unproperty white males have gotten a bad rap. I got all that, but that's not my thing. I'm happy to have colleagues that's their thing, right? That's just not mine. So I have special concern in the plight of race in Black America, given my interests. But I don't really want to put that out as like the fundamental category of difference, although now, this is where it might get controversial, I don't really think you tell the story of America in a serious way and even understand so much a lot of these other things if you don't go through race. I just think that's like apple pie, that's like baseball, that's like the Constitution. You gotta get the race story to do any of this other stuff. So I do think that. I had more to say, but maybe I should stop there and see if you have something else to say.
I have one more question I want to ask before we open it up, because
Yeah.
we want to have plenty of time for people to raise questions and make points here. And the last question is something that actually in talking with both of you about this before we came here, you both expressed an interest in, and that is this. It aligns very well with the goals of the COMPAS program, our interdisciplinary goals. The question is, how should philosophers be working together with social scientists and maybe with policy people and lawyers and so forth in order to address these concerns about inequality? There's been, we've all heard about the silos at the university, and philosophers have oftentimes dealt with only with very abstract questions and maybe only gestured towards some of the applications, but it is a premise of the COMPAS program that we need to bring together the empirical research, the people who are actually doing applied policy and stuff, to those who are thinking about these things in an abstract way. And I think each of you have tried to do that in your work. And so I'd like to know your thoughts about how to do that productively and effectively.
Yes, so I, great question, and so there's something we didn't touch on. So, the subtitle for the conference, right, an interdisciplinary conference about the causes and consequences of disparity. So let's deal with the consequences for a second. So how's that come into play? So go back to our gaps between the haves and the have-nots along these different dimensions or measures of well-being. Here's a way to get into the consequence. Some people might say, okay, look, I've got the worry about the worse off, the suffering of the worse off. I've got the worry about unequal status or worth, the worry about too much control, influence, possible domination coming from that, the worry about people not being behind the 8 ball, the worry about not respecting people's rights to an equal share of the benefit of the resources that they've helped to create in society. But then there are other kinds of considerations. You might think, for example, that dealing with health disparities of various kinds will maybe make us happier, right? Will cause us to flourish more. You might think that dealing with disparities of various kinds in the economic realm might make for better democracy. People, people feel like they're getting screwed all the time, they're not getting their fair share. We might imagine that they'll check out from the political process in different ways. And if we're celebrating the importance, the value of democracy in America, we're actually prepared to take that value globally, even in places where they're maybe not sure they want it, but we take it to them anyway, right? Because we think that's a good thing. So you might say we become happier, we become healthier, we have a better democracy if we deal with certain gaps between the haves and the have-nots. So that's a way in which now we're appealing to very rich ethical ideals. And if there are people doing empirical work out there relying on these kinds of background assumptions, and then of course doing the qualitative work to sort of tease out what people think about that, we could supplement that discussion, I think, that in ways that bring some of the theoretical, long-standing theoretical discussions that philosophers have had a hand in shaping into play, right? So that's one thing. But my own view, and as you said, Don, I've been very passionate about doing this collaborative work, not just like paying lip service to it, but publishing with and doing grant proposals with social scientists and policy people. My own view is that this is a complex problem. It's hard. And we have to know something about the causes and consequences of disparities. We have to be able to put them in historical context. We have to know about what's possible and what's not in the realm of law and public policy. And we have to know what the case is to be made for why we should do this or that, where the case is partly based on ethical or political values of various kinds. And to have all that happen, it seems to me, requires the same type of commitment to interdisciplinary work that we find in the sciences. I just think that it demands that same thing. It's not building a bridge, it's not flying a plane, but solving the problem of the ghetto or solving the problem of poverty, that's like a doozy. I mean, we haven't done it yet. And, tougher policing is certainly not the answer, for example. So, I think that we got to challenge ourselves as scholars to come out of our silos and come up with a set of research questions and problems to move this thing forward in productive ways, and be prepared to defer to our colleagues in the way that we see more deference typically goes on in the sciences around social problems. And this is the social problem that keeps me up at night, that's for sure.
So let me throw it open to the audience here, and raise your hand, and I recognize you. Yes?
Yes, hi. Before you're talking about, there's certain cases it's clear whether the person's responsible or the rest of us is responsible.
Yeah.
Okay, so the case of someone.
Can you start again and repeat your
Yes,
question?
you were saying earlier that there are certain cases it's clear that the individual is responsible for his choices he or she makes versus we as a society are responsible. So the clear case, if someone jumps off the bridge constantly as his calling, it's probably on him about his medical care. When it comes to the jobs being all in the suburbs and there's no convenient transportation, that's a structural issue. But I'm thinking about so much is that middle ground in between.
Good, excellent.
And how do you draw the distinction between what's structural and what's choice? I mean, so say patterns of thinking, habits in the community that maybe some would identify as not so helpful in advancing the young people, for example. Is that structural? Is it choice? And so I'm just wondering, how much are we presupposing this kind of detached, rational actor, but rather that we know that all of us are constituted by our communities, and it's really hard to separate those two. So how would you address that?
Okay.
And you thought I asked hard questions.
Well, yeah, right. Well, but you just put two things on the floor. Let's just deal with the first thing. That the detached rational actor bit is that's for like maybe lunch. But the first bit of what you said was right on. I mean, look, there's one thing that, you know what, one of the things they pay philosophers big bucks for? We're real good at making distinctions. I mean, we in the distinction bit, we are some distinction choppers. But we gotta do that because we're really in the business in part of clarifying things that we might just pass over like this is uncomplicated, but once you sort of sit down for a little bit, you have some wine, you rolling, no, this is more complicated. And so we start the process of making it less complicated by drawing important distinctions. Now, you got me, right? One, I didn't say exactly what you said I said, but what I did say, there is a choice circumstance distinction. And I'll tell you something interesting, you'll like this. And that's made analytically as a way of, again, accommodating this point that you guys don't take liberty serious, you egalitarians. And here's like, okay, let me show you we can take it seriously. You guys think people should be held responsible for their choices. Okay, we got you. So here's what we'll do. Not everything is about people's choices. There's structure stuff too. So if there's structure stuff, then we want to pull out our egalitarian apparatus and say that we got to spread the obligations, right? But of course, that is, in some senses, there's a distinction, but it's a crude one. Now, one of the things that I've done in my own work is just in working with social scientists, I said, this is complicated. In particular, I'm concerned about the interaction between the choices and the circumstances. You see. So I think a good example of a name that many more people may be familiar with in the room who's done work in the area of education in social science is Claude Steele, right? So, his idea of stereotype threat was popularized, right? And people know about that ideal, right? So you go into it thinking as a man or as a woman that people already think you're not going to do as good on a test because, as Lawrence Summers said, women are not good in, STEM, right? And, we know blacks aren't really that good at this stuff because, they're black, right? So that's all in the air. Then you got to take the test and then you underperform. So here's an interaction between maybe circumstances and the individual in a certain way. I mean, that's an example some people have used to emphasize the interaction. There are other ones, maybe even some better ones. But I think one of the things we get from the collaboration between philosophy and the social science is a way to get some methods and some resources to tell a more complex story about these things. So I did a paper with an econometrician on school choice and low-income African-American single-family parents. And we used some of his data and method to basically say, look, there's the left that's talking about circumstance, there's the right that's talking about choice. When we think about people's ability to take advantage of school choice, we find that there's this complicated interaction between the choices they make and the circumstances that they find themselves in. And single-parent African-American families in particular have a somewhat different set of circumstances that prevent them from accessing the opportunities in the same way. Now, there's no way I write that by myself, right? But I see the distinction in place. We bring it together, we complicate it, and then we say something about maybe broader lessons that we can have as we think about how to deal with policy in this complex way. So I think that's a great observation, and it's pointing to a place where we can benefit, I think, from talking to one another. But philosophers have to start with the distinctions. This is what we got to start with that often.
Yes. Professor Wilkinson.
Perhaps I should have, because I'm going to have a go later, I shouldn't be taking up time now. Two things, though. One is in the interaction between sort of individual, I don't know what you call them, capacities or whatever, and environment, the structures. I think one set of experiments that shows how extraordinarily intertwined they are,
Yes.
Are these stereotype threat experiments.
Yes.
Where, you give people little pen and pencil tests or whatever, and one group you give them some sort of a little subtle reminder that they belong to a group that's normally thought of as worse at this kind of test.
Yes.
Little things like that make a huge difference in outcome. The World Bank published a report of Indian children of different castes given little tests. High and low caste children did equally well before they knew each other's caste. As soon as they did, low caste children did much less well. And that's been done with class and gender and ethnicity and so on. So it really shows the inseparability of the structure and the. But the other thing, you were talking before this was opened up to questions, as if solving these problems depended on us having answers to the sort of questions you were discussing. What's the relationship actually between that and the kind of social movements that will or won't solve these problems? And in the last, 5 or 10 years, we've seen concern for inequality growing. That's not because we've answered any of these questions.
Yes, certainly I hope I didn't give the impression that any work that we do either in this room as philosophers or sociologists or economists or historians is going to solve our problem.
It was more that you're implying it would allow us to act, and we couldn't earlier.
No, not even that. I think that we got to step back and ask ourselves what our roles are as academics and researchers, okay? So when I talk to my friends who are activists, they think none of this stuff matters. I don't care if you're a philosopher or a sociologist or, what matters is on the street. You should be marching. You should be getting locked up, right? So you should be in the grassroots. That's where the action is. So we clearly think that there's some value in what we do as scholars and as researchers. And I think that it's important to think of the problem as one that requires a division of labor. We don't get to be in this room together without the civil rights movement, with people basically taking the water hose, getting bit by the police dogs, getting almost bludgeoned to death for trying to vote. We're not sitting here, all of us, right? But at the same time, the language of justice, the language of bending the arc of the moral universe, right? The work that had to be done before you get to Brown versus Board of Ed, that Kenneth and Mamie Clark did, the experiments that they did, you don't get the Supreme Court doing what it did in Brown v. Board without that work having been done. So, we got to decide where's our vocation? What are we called to do? I'm not a marcher. I go to marches, but I'm not going to be marching. All right, but not to put that down, I'm just saying, but I am in a space where I'm calling attention to demands of justice that are coming out of that space, and always like to have some kind of influence maybe, but that's not why we're in the business either. We're trying to figure some stuff out. My only point was that as scholars, as academics, there's value in coming together to deal with complex problems, that we may make some small contribution to. So, like, this is a couple years ago, the World Bank called me to DC, and I was like, well, what the hell is the World Bank calling me for, right? I don't have any data. No, not even that. Believe it or not, because I don't, you know, it's all relative, you know. I mean, of course, I don't have all that much of it. But, you know, but anyway, no. Believe it or not, it was a conference on inequality at their headquarters in D.C. And they wanted to put their economists in the room with some philosophers and other people that were thinking about issues of justice because they found that their clients, the world states, were less, because of all the uprising, the Arab Spring, all the stuff that was going on, it wasn't just about efficiency anymore. They realized, well, all of a sudden, the story's not all about efficiency. People are talking about democracy, justice, rights, having a better life. And they were like, what the hell is all that about? And so here I am, and it was pretty nice. There was a nice spread. I'm up in there. You know, I'm with economists from Brazil and, you know, all this stuff. And I'm like, oh, really? Y'all just getting around and it's not efficiency? But yeah, they said, so what can you philosophers tell us about that? And I said, okay, I can tell you a couple things about that. So there it was. Now, I mean, what happened, what they did with that, I didn't keep up with it. But I gave them my 2 cents, and, you know, I had a nice time in D.C. for a week. Heard some good jazz, had some good food, had some good wine.
In the back by the aisle, yes. So wait for 1 second for the microphone.
Good afternoon. Thanks for taking my question. I should preface my question or comment with an acknowledgement I am a social scientist by training. Although my research interest is cultural psychology, which tends to be transdisciplinary. But one of the questions I've always had about philosophy, particularly this conversation on morality, ethics, and values, is historical context. So I was so happy to hear you go back, for me as a non-immigrant African American, and frame a historical context. I think we would get much further if philosophy, pardon me, as a discipline, might take a more historical, I mean, what were the ethics, the values, and morality that allowed Europeans to enslave African people as chattel? What were those ethics, what were those values, and how are they manifest today? Because I'm seeing them manifest today. So I'm not sure, maybe this is research you all do, I'm just not following your literature, but I just would be interested in your response to that.
Oh my goodness, boy. They must have planted you in the audience for me. Okay, well you're not following the literature because it's not there. That's the first answer. Really, largely it's not there. There's not a whole lot of it. I mean, one important exception, I should say for sure, is the philosopher Charles Mills. He's got a very, very important work called The Racial Contract. And that would be something to look up. It's an easy read. Not quite an easy read, but it's a short read, I should say. He'd be mad at me if I said it was an easy read, but he won't be that mad at me because, you know, he wrote it to be accessible. So, but that's one work. But look, that's a great question. So there will be some more literature shortly. I'm sorry, I'm trying to plug my stuff, but I'm being serious. I just had the good fortune to have the last year off from teaching. And that's because I had a grant to finish a book that I've been writing with a historian of African American education, John Rury, who's in the Ed School at the University of Kansas. He's an outstanding historian. And basically, I mean, the title of the book is The Color of Mind, Why the Origins of the Achievement Gap Matter for Justice. And what we do is we go back, in the first instance, to 19th century America. And we show how the ideology that was dominant at the time, that blacks were inferior to whites in intellect, temperament, and character, shaped the development of American education and schooling. Basically, in the first instance, denying African American schooling, and when they were providing it to them on very unequal terms. And we link the ideology to the schooling. And we say, of course, that the 19th century Americans weren't the first to come by this idea. It wasn't a new creation for them. And I go back to the European Enlightenment, and we talk about some of the mighty dead philosophers, in particular David Hume and Immanuel Kant, who made important contributions to the ideology of black inferiority, and how Jefferson, who was a big fan of the Enlightenment, I taught at Charlottesville for 1 year, was telling Bill this, picked up this ideology, and in his notes on the state of Virginia, we see remnants of it. So we basically say, here, there's a large, when you're thinking about the achievement gap, here's what got me into this. When I started thinking about education stuff, Roland Fryer was hot. How many people heard of Roland Fryer in this room? He's like the big-time economist. I think maybe the youngest African-American to get tenure at Harvard in economics. That's not a small feat, you know. But he basically made his reputation on pushing the idea that cash for grades was the way to close the racial achievement gap. You know, hey, we incentivize everything, why not that, right? Give the kids sneakers and books and, you know, not books, I'm sorry, sneakers and McDonald's gift certificates, I meant to say, and maybe they'll do better in school. And I was reading this guy was showing up all over the place. I said, come on. I said, you mean to tell me you really think that's the answer? Right, that's gotta be more complicated than that. And so this is how I got like into stuff on educational inequality. I started through his work, then I started reading more broadly. When I got to my historian friend, he was saying to me, Derrick, this is crazy. These social scientists, I mean, no disrespect, he's a historian. He said, they are dominating the public understanding of the achievement gap. People like Sean Reardon and, you know, all good people, right? But what they're missing is all of this stuff is ahistorical, the way they're dealing with it. This very idea of racial gaps in achievement and intelligence, this is an old story. You want to write a book with me about this? I said, nah, man, I don't have time for that. I don't have time to write a book with you on this. I'm glad he stayed on me, because we just put together a monster. And so it should be out with the University of Chicago Press sometime next year. So.
Good for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Where's the mic? Oh, right here. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the relationship between inequality and redistribution to, like, make disparity, like to considering disparities, and the question of reparations. So one of the things that you were thinking about was, well, there's a way to separate out individual choices from sort of social structures.
Good.
But it seems like, especially bringing up the history of African American slavery, it seems like thinking about reparation might also add in another consideration that is about how those systemic structures came into existence in the first place.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to know what you thought those sorts of relationships were.
So good. So it's funny, you guys are gonna crack up. So I wrote one paper, it was kind of like an overview paper on reparations and inequality, and a real short thing, right, for what's that journal? Philosophy Compass, is that what it's called? Yeah. I wrote a little overview paper on reparations and inequality. I was surprised how many people read it, but it was an overview paper. But at the time I wrote that paper, I was thinking about writing a book on this. But then I started to think, this is a waste of time, because this is like a non-starter, period, in this current political environment. And of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates came out with this Atlantic piece, and you know what he did with that, right? He rolled with that one, right? But still, because I spent some time with social psychologists, and I thought a bit about people's defensive reactions when you confront them with injustice or inequality, different ways in which people sort of distance themselves from feeling like they somehow should be on the hook, right? Blaming the victim is one, familiar way. Well, it wasn't me. Well, my ancestors were actually okay. All these kinds of responses. And I just start to think, I think we gotta be serious. I spent a lot of time, as I said, in red states. I'm somewhat more practical. I want to like what's really feasible, given what we know about people's psychology, what their interests are. How can we make a more convincing case for pushing the demands of justice under these circumstances? But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you tell the structural story and you bring your favorite social scientist research to bear to support the structural claims you're making, then one thing you want to say, if it's structure, then it might require some kind of radical redistribution, and let's just call it reparations. I mean, many years ago, Richard knows this, I mean, you know, there's a significant scholar that works in the area of African American health, David K. Williams, who wrote this piece on reparations for African American health disparities, right? And he tied it to housing, and then basically the negative impact of living in segregated communities on black people's health, and tied this to a reparations agenda. Cool, we could definitely do that, but I think we also have to think about the constraints, particularly in this country, that we have in the law. Race-conscious remedies right now are really, really difficult in our current climate, and also given our current constitutional structure. Now, it might change, but it is what it is right now. So, I mean, that's a lot to say, but at least that's a sense of where I'm coming from with that. I'm operating in a more, I think, pragmatic space. I mean, much the same way I think Derrick Bell was thinking about in his work in law and race. I think other thinkers in the history of black political thought, Du Bois, I think King for sure, particularly later King, got to be much more pragmatic. He knew it was one thing after blacks basically won the Civil Rights Act in '64 and the Voting Rights Act. But when King started to talk about poverty and inequality, people wasn't having that. And not long after that, of course, he was assassinated. So we didn't really get we didn't see it all play out. But he clearly turned his attention in a very sharp way from formal inequality, blacks not being able to sit at the lunch counter, to having the resources to actually eat lunch at the counter. Now, he didn't call for reparations, but somebody might say, well, that's where he was going.
Allie?
Sorry to be so long-winded about that, but I'm kind of...
It's coming.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask a little bit more about Dawn's question about the distinction between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. So you seem to suggest that, look, we maybe should be a little bit concerned about pulling these two apart, because if there is such great disparity in the outcomes, that should reflect something maybe about the opportunity. And I was thinking you could maybe even say something stronger about being skeptical about how much they can
I'm always happy for somebody to say something stronger, right? But I start with the weak thing, right? Because hard to make counterexamples. But
yeah, I'm like skeptical of this move to try and say like, well, we have equality of opportunity, so all's well. So one of the things that you said earlier was that disparity of outcomes can affect social standing, right? And so one thing you might think is that if there is this great disparity of outcomes that's affecting social standing, right? Social standing seems to be a major contributor to who we're willing to extend opportunities to, right? And so if that seems to be like a really good, clear connection between inequality of outcome and inequality of opportunity, at least a potential one, that would give us reason to address the inequality of outcome directly, rather than just thinking that there's a sort of indicator relationship between the inequality of outcome and inequality of opportunity.
I'm not quite sure I get that.
Okay, so can I try again?
Yeah, please do.
Sure. So the thought was something like, so I'm trying to think of like a really clear case in which it seems like maybe certain kinds of social biases affect hiring decisions. So like the really clear case is like if you have a certain kind of name.
Okay, good. The resume thing, right?
Right, exactly. It tends to make it, they tend not to extend hiring opportunities to people with traditionally like African American lower income names, right? Yeah. So that seems like equality of opportunity is being affected, right? By something like social standing, but I was trying to think about how your claim that disparity of outcomes has a direct impact on social standing, right? The way in which we perceive others and their status in community is in part determined by the disparity of outcomes, and we see like how certain groups of people are succeeding or not succeeding. And so that was the suggestion was something like.
Here's what I thought I got it, but that example was useful, and I think I probably just look at it a bit differently from you. I don't really see that necessarily implicates differences in social standing. So you've got, you've got Lakeisha and you've got Lucy, right? And they just come through the door in the resumes. Now you got Lakeisha, and then of course you're like, Lakeisha, she got to be from that part of town, which means she's probably African American. Lucy, well, she's probably cool. And you give Lucy the interview. Now, in that case, all that's happening is like some kind of stereotype or prejudice is kicking in, and it's kicking in and making this arbitrary, for the point of view of getting this job that just requires certain skills that both people seem to clearly have. It's making this arbitrary factor that shouldn't have anything to do with this job that requires certain skills be a factor in the selection process. Now, it maybe like Lakeisha is like from a middle to upper class African American family, even. We don't, and Lucy is from a low income family. So status, it seems to me, is not necessarily implicated. What might be implicated, again, are larger views about, prejudices about African Americans, so forth and so on. And you're having now this arbitrary classification being operative in a selection process, thereby making it unfair. I should be evaluated on the merits of the abilities that are required for the job. And the resumes demonstrate both of them have that. Is that, so I don't quite see this.
The thought was something like the stereotype bias is informed by seeing disparities in outcomes across society. So you don't see as many people with names like Lakeisha in high-powered positions, so you form biases about people named Lakeisha, right? And as a result, that informs the opportunities that you grant. Right?
Okay. Okay, well, sure. Okay, so that's the standing that you had in mind.
Yes. I took social standing
Yeah.
as a much broader implication than just.
Okay, maybe if you put it that way, I could see what you're after there, and you were making that point to show that we can make a stronger claim about the importance of outcome by tying it to standing. Okay, I think that's good. I like that.
So my disclaimer is that I'm sitting in this space as an advocate and an activist.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Why is that a disclaimer?
It's a disclaimer because I'm probably one of those people like, we're sitting here talking and someone's dying.
That's what I said in response to one of the earlier questions.
Right. So that said, one of the things I'm thinking about, and especially in the spaces where I've been, where we're talking about where I and people who I know have lived through trying to do this work in this capacity and battling in between cultural code switching and double consciousness and trying to do all this work is when it boils down to, do the people who are in the position of power to do something about this, do they care or not? Because you can have empirical evidence of this. You can have, you can bring up philosophers' names, you can bring up all kinds of things to support saying, see, this is what this looks like. But right now I'm sitting here thinking, well, what is the historical context of philosophy behind care? What has history shown us about what people in positions of power do with the concept of caring? Do you care or not? And if you do care, what does it look like when you did? What did you do with caring or not?
Okay, good. I think was that. So here's something. You might not like the sound of this, but I think this is true. I mean it's true about us. I mean, we just got to be honest about this. Yeah, you might say, like, I'll give you a great example. So, one of the things that happens is people move up in class position, and you know, that often shows up in where they live, and, you know, what crowds they hang out with, where they send their kids to school. Now, let's say you've moved up in class position. You've come from, you know, the other side of 8 Mile or wherever it is in your own space. And there's still all kind of hell breaking loose where you came from. And somebody says, well, don't you care anymore? I mean, you of all people, you know what this is about because you were one of us, right? But now you done moved on up, right? You done did, you know, the Jeffersons thing, and now, you know, there you are. No, of course I care, right? I care because you're right. But I care about some other things too now, right? I mean, one, I care about these kids I gotta raise. And as much as I want things to change on the other side of 8 Mile, I'm not moving back over there and sending my kids to school over there. Because I care about them too. So just a simple point, right? Bring care online, that's fine. But we care about lots of different kinds of things. Just like we have different kinds of values, different kinds of interests. And they all gotta sort of battle each other. I mean, I'm sure a politician, I'm not a politician, I don't aspire to be one, but I'm sure they're gonna say this, right? Because they've got people pulling in all directions. But what about this cause? What about that cause? What about this cause? But if you're not for this and you're not for that, and they somehow try to negotiate all that, right? And to figure out what policy ultimately to support. So I don't think we necessarily have to deny care, but we can complicate the story by saying there's lots of things, and then we got to figure out how to make the trade-offs. So competing continuums of care. That's one, absolutely. I mean, don't you think, obviously? I mean, just think about the point about, I care about where I came from and the people there that I've left behind, but no, I'm not going to experiment with my daughters. Just not going to do it. They're not going to school there, and I'm not living there. Because I know what I'm going to have to deal with. And I don't want to deal with that. So I can find other ways to lend my support. I could mentor, right? I could go into the community. I could write an article. You know, maybe somebody will read it or an op-ed. I can be in spaces like this and inspire my students and empower them. Not knowing what they're going to go on to do with their lives, but maybe my having inspired them might make them give back in ways where maybe they have resources that I didn't have or opportunities I don't have to go back and help. And just put it out there. I mean, what else can we do?
I think we have time for one more
That's
question.
a good question.
I'd like to have it from a non-philosopher, and I think you might qualify. Unless...
Yeah, I'd like to have it from a non-philosopher too.
I'll bet.
For the last question. Are you a philosopher? No. A card-carrying one?
Are you or have you ever been?
So we've talked this afternoon about the structural approach, the historical approach, some of the cultural approach in terms of stereotype threat. And these are all areas in which I do work. I work here at Ohio State for the Kirwan Institute, and so I do a lot of work around
they do great
structural
work.
disadvantage.
Wonderful
Thank
work.
you.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm curious because I've actually never thought about including philosophers in the work that we do.
There you go.
So thank you for that. But I'm curious about the philosophers helping us unpack and make sense of the new science around, or newer science around race and cognition, and how quickly and easily our implicit racial biases in particular can be triggered, especially for those of us who consider ourselves egalitarian.
Absolutely.
So how do we make sense of the fact that these two realities can exist in one person?
Well, let's make sure that we talk for sure during the course of the conference. I'm serious about the division of labor, right? So in the last 6 years, I've co-authored 2 papers with a social psychologist at the University of Kansas, Nyla Branscombe, and she's a really prominent figure on collective guilt and responsibility. And she thinks about it just domestically and also globally. And so I've learned a lot from Nyla. And there are other social psychologists that I've interacted with. And I think that in my own case, the points that you just put on the floor are reasons why I proceed with more caution when I'm evaluating whether we should pursue certain kinds of strategies for trying to make society more just. Because I want to take seriously some of this data about race and cognition and see if we might craft in a more nuanced way the demands of justice that are more closely tracking these cognitive realities. So anybody out there that is reading the paper, you're watching politics go down in America, right? You can't ignore these kinds of factors. You just simply can't ignore them, right? But at the same time, you got your egalitarian instincts, and you want to advocate for your egalitarian projects in ways that you hope can be somewhat persuasive, but also preserve the ethical, kind of foundation, the spirit of it. But how can you do it in a way that's just a bit more closely tied to what we know on the ground about how people really behave, right? Psychologically and in other ways. I think that's important, and I think the kinds of exchanges with philosophers who are interested in issues of race and justice can help enrich the dialogue by blending the philosophical with the social scientific in various ways. And look, this is not like, what I'm saying is like, in some sense, an innovation I think we're seeing. My colleague Liz Anderson has been important in this regard. But philosophers of physics, philosophers of biology, of course, can you think of doing philosophy of physics and not knowing any physics? Philosophy of biology, not knowing any biology? Or philosophy of psychology, not doing the cognitive science work, maybe psycholinguistic work? Philosophers have been doing this for a long time in philosophy of the natural sciences and in the context of philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. But they haven't gotten around to it yet in the space of social and political when you're thinking about injustice and inequality, right, which are social problems that I think require the same type of appreciation for the work that's going on in the social sciences around these issues. That's my view, at least. Now, I may have to wait till after you get tenure, right? But that's another story we can have over coffee, right? Because we know our institutions are not set up for the kind of interdisciplinary stuff that we value, right? And you don't want to do this before you get set up with tenure, because then you're going to have a problem in all kinds of ways. Where are you going to publish your work? First of all, is a big problem. I have problems finding venues for the kind of work I'm doing, because it's like, who's doing this? What is this? How do we read this? Right? But that's another story.
Okay, please join me in thanking, in her absence, Rekha Nath, who showed grit in coming here and trying, and Derrick Darby for showing the door.